Let's get back to the president's comments on race this morning. His attacks against Maryland Congressman Elijah Cummings are the most recent in a slew of racially charged comments about other politicians. Earlier this month, the president suggested that 4 first-term minority congresswomen should go back to the countries that they came from. I want to bring in Touré, host of the podcast Democracy-ish. Touré, what is your take here? A lot of people are saying this is part of a strategy by the president. Do you buy that?
I mean, do I buy that? Sort of. I'm struggling with the notion of, is he a strategic person or does he just say whatever's in his gut?
Yeah.
He seems to think that there's a group of people who will respond to this sort of racism. But I don't really want to participate in the general media conversation of, is this a political strategy? This is divisive. This is hateful. This is very dangerous for the country. Whether or not he is reelected in 2020, we're going to have to deal with this pain and this cancer that he's brought to the surface for many years. We have a deep divisiveness in the country. As your polling suggested before, we don't even have a clear understanding as a country of whether or not these are actually racist comments. We have the right coming out and saying, no, they're not racist. He just genuinely cares about Baltimore. We have people like Nikki Haley tweeting, let's stop the back and forth. There is not a back and forth. We have a president who has racist attacks against a congressman. He doesn't mention the governor. He doesn't mention the mayor. He mentions one particular congressman. Part of his district is beautiful and upscale. Part of his district has problems. But part of those problems are not related to the character of the people, which Trump seems to always want to lean it on, but the war on drugs, gentrification, systemic racism. There's lots of problems that have plagued Baltimore that run throughout the country. But Trump does not seem to think that the people of Baltimore are his constituents. They are other. He only represents his base.
Touré, I think one thing we can probably, maybe not, but probably all agree on, and that all of this is distracting a lot from getting things dealt with in Washington, from dealing with policies, from addressing the issues. Now, the president's aides are saying that this isn't about race, that it's actually about crime rates, but you're not buying that they're saying this is a policy thing. What's your take on that?
Well, no, I mean, this is what they typically do, that he comes out and says something racist or just crazy, and then they come back and say, no, this is what he actually meant. No, what he actually meant was a racist attack on Elijah Cummings, which only followed a racist attack on the Squad, and then he threw in Al Sharpton for good measure. This is a president, this is a person who likes to virtually figuratively stand on black and brown people's necks in order to seem taller to white people, right? I read his whole 2016 campaign as Make America White Again. It was all about white entitlement, white victimhood, and white supremacy. And he's ramping up to once again have his message be all about that.
So let me ask you this. I think the natural reaction for most people when they hear something like this is to respond to it. Are we just playing into the president's hand by doing that? Is there another way that this should be approached?
You know, it's interesting. That issue is tricky because you want your lawmakers to stand up and say, hey, that's racist, that's inappropriate, that's immoral, that is not the sort of country that we have. But yes, then you're dealing with issues in the mud and you're not dealing with the actual campaign. I'm not sure how the Democrats are going to deal with that going forward, because I don't think that people on the left need to hear any more about whether or not the president's racist. They're already sold on that notion. So continuing to bang that gong does not tell them anything they don't already know. But black voters are a core of the Democratic Party, right? I read Steve Kornacki's really important report that he brought out this morning, talking about how there's not been a Democratic nominee since 1992 who did not get an overwhelming majority of black voters. And this time we're looking at about 1 in 4 votes in the primary will come from a black voter. So it's an incredibly important constituency, and black voters do want to hear their leaders standing up to racism. But we also need to hear about actual policies and actual things that we want to do. And we can't talk about Medicare for all or Green New Deal or an economic program if we're just running around saying, hey, this guy's really racist, and that's a real problem.
Touré, then, to that notion, do you expect the Democratic candidates to start hitting this or addressing this in the debate tonight? And if you do, I know, again, this is like the million-dollar question, is there a way that you think they should deal with this in a way that's just going to backfire?
Again, I don't think it's going to backfire with a Democratic audience. We're still in the primary, right? So, I mean, I would rather see them talk about issues and define who they are for the American people. Standing on a Democratic primary stage and saying the president is racist is, just red meat for the left, and it's certainly not telling us anything we don't already know that he hasn't already proven over and over and over. So make your case on who you are rather than telling us who he is, because we already know who he is. As for if it's going to have a backlash, look, people who are confused about whether or not the president is racist are already lost and probably dealing with, life in a bubble that has no connection to reality whatsoever. So, that's them. We're going to have to find a way to reunify the country at some point. But the president is systematically and almost week by week saying things that divide us on racial lines, that make black and brown people feel traumatized, feel threatened, feel scared, and allow white people on the right to come out and say, I don't see the racism. He's just asking if Alexandria would like to go back home to Puerto Rico. She's never lived in Puerto Rico, or just asking if maybe Baltimore could be better. No, he's not asking if Baltimore. And, the thing I also wonder, where are the black Republicans? Why are they not jumping up to say, hey, can we make an appeal without being racist? Like, it doesn't have to be racist, does it? But they say nothing. I mean, the GOP in general says nothing, but I don't really expect anything from the white Republican elected officials at this point, but I'm disappointed in them as well. But where are the black Republican elected officials and non-elected officials? Where are they? Why are they not saying, hey, do we have to have racism as part of the appeal? That makes me uncomfortable.
Touré, the thing that, it boggles my mind, and I think it boggles a lot of people's minds, is that if these kinds of conversations or these kinds of issues were happening with any other politician, any of the Democratic candidates, it would seem to hurt them. They would have to defend themselves on racism. They would take a hit. We even saw how the accusations, from Kamala Harris hurt Joe Biden when they were getting into the issues of busing. That was a tough couple of days for him there. It just seems like when it happens with President Trump, it's a completely different situation. Is this hurting him at all? Or is it just playing into his base? I mean, what is your general takeaway, on how this is impacting Trump?
I mean, it doesn't seem to be hurting his followers. They seem to be fine with it. I think that they are consuming news sources that tell them it's not racist. And of course, every time the liberals see anything, they call it racist. So you can ignore that, which is going to be problematic for this country in terms of dealing with issues of race going into the future decades. But we notice the president has been incredibly consistent at 42% approval for a very long time. Very, very little can budge him out of that, and if anything does, he snaps right back to that. So he's certainly not able to add to his coalition, which you would hope to do in your first term to bring in some new people. And he's certainly not been able to do that. So I'm not sure how this is going to not hurt him. Although, the discussion of is it helping him makes me very uncomfortable, because you're talking about dealing with America's deepest poison as, is it helping him to inject that into the country? Like, I would like to see us have a more higher-minded discussion of saying this is horrible for the country, no matter what way each individual voter takes it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.